The Flash Season 7 recently ended, giving us 2 new villains, and also one villain that ended its storyline, which didn't end in Season 6 because of COVID. This allows me to make an updated ranking for all the main villains of The Flash with 3 new villains. And I wanted to do something different this time. Usually I rank from worst to best. This time, because the newer seasons gave us pretty much exclusively bad villains, I wanted to make a ranking going from best to worst, because the newer ones are going to be the ones I'm going to really be focusing on. So with that in mind, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe to this channel. So let's start the video with the best villain from The Flash. Now, if I'm being honest, I've gotten rather tired of Tom Cavanagh's Reverse Flash, and at this point, I really get no excitement from seeing him on the show, and I will get to that a little bit later in the video. However, that doesn't change the fact that in this season, Eobard Thawne was absolutely the definitive main villain of The Flash. Thawne complemented the season-long storyline perfectly, and his connection to the main backstory of Barry's made him feel much more personal than any other main villain we have gotten since, even though one of them was Barry Allen himself. I think Tom Cavanagh did a very good job in the role when it did make sense, which is within the context of Season 1, and he and Barry absolutely had one of the best rivalries in the Arrowverse, so it's no secret Reverse Flash is the fan favorite main villain of The Flash, and I would have to agree with that, as they haven't really topped themselves after their first villain. The season-long storyline of Season 2 and how the main villain connects to it is certainly not as strong as in Season 1, plus Zoom doesn't really have that personal connection that Barry and Thawne did, and I mention this because while there are definitely things that Thawne does better and that's why he's higher on the list, Zoom also improves on certain other aspects of being a main villain over Thawne. For instance, Zoom is certainly scarier. He's the scariest, most menacing and intimidating villain on The Flash. His mask, his voice, his music, and all the feats that we see him accomplish on the show, where he's seen as to being so much faster than Barry in the beginning, it perfectly created a truly terrifying villain, and we haven't gotten a scarier one since. Zoom was also part of probably the best twist on the show, where they used the comic book lore of Jay Garrick being from Earth 2 and the newer version of Jay Garrick being a younger character to trick us into not even considering that Jay cannot actually be Jay and that he is Zoom. This twist, along with the menace that was Zoom, plus the pretty great rivalry with The Flash, made for a fantastic villain. Bloodwork was not given a lot of episodes to be the main villain, but I think that worked mostly in his favor, as he never fell into the classic tropes of the storyline being stretched out, or having to come up with excuses for why the villain hasn't been defeated yet. This is something that even Zoom had a bit of a problem with near the end of Season 2, so maybe Bloodwork having a little bit less episodes, and it's not too few, it's a good amount, worked in his favor. Aside from that, they did something different with the character, which is show his origin story on screen and in chronological order instead of explaining it later, which made me connect with his motivation and his backstory in a very unique way. But what is possibly the most effective aspect of the character is how they smartly wove him into the crisis setup, with both him and Barry believing they are going to die and whether or not they're going to be doing something about it, which was very effective for making a very solid main villain even 6 seasons into the show, and he somehow managed to make it into the top 3. Initially, having a third speedster in a row felt very tiresome, and the main conflict naturally became very derivative, as it's the main villain is faster than Barry, and Barry has to get faster to stop him. And yeah, they probably should have waited another season or two. Having like a gap season in between Zoom and Savitar would have made Savitar a lot more effective in the end, as there just wouldn't have been that speedster fatigue, because looking back, speedsters have almost always been the most effective villains, so having another one, even if it is the third in the row, it made sense, and honestly, he was quite effective as a main villain. His suit is one of the best speedster suits on the show. He has a really cool voice, and the mystery behind the character was certainly very intriguing throughout the season. There were some underwhelming aspects of the character, like we really didn't see Grant in the role nearly enough, and that side of the character was not explained too well because we rarely saw it. It was more a tell and less show. So yeah, he's not perfect as a villain, but overall I would say Savitar is one of the better main villains from The Flash, and definitely not as bad as I initially remember thinking. Devoe certainly had the potential to be considered one of the best villains on the show because they had a pretty great actor in the role, and whenever he was played by Neil Sandilands, I felt like he felt like a real character who had an interesting and a really cool dynamic with Marlize and Barry. But then there was the body swap storyline, and until he came back to Neil when he took over Ralph's body, it kind of felt like Devoe completely left the show and it was replaced by a series of characters who are doing a very bad job at impersonating the Thinker, and it didn't help that this season was already filled with villains of the week. It didn't help that the main villain felt like a villain of the week every time as well. That storyline should have never lasted as long as it did, and also it shouldn't have ever existed in the first place, because when Neil Sandilands came back, Devoe, he felt like he came back as well, and he came back to being a pretty good villain. So sadly, Devoe ends up a lot lower on the list than what he could have been, because I did really enjoy him when he was done well. As I mentioned earlier, I am sick of seeing Tom Cavanaugh in the role of Eobard Thawne because it just makes no sense. It made no sense in Crisis on Earth X, it made no sense in Season 5, 6, or 7, and it will make no sense in the upcoming Armageddon crossover. Now, with that being said, Thawne was actually pretty good as a behind-the-scenes villain who's orchestrating the plot in Season 5. The story gave Thawne the chance to show more of his intelligence and knowledge of how to manipulate the timeline, and less so of a physically imposing speedster outside of the actual finale, which I thought worked quite well. Honestly, that was my favorite part of Season 5, Thawne manipulating Nora, Nora working with Thawne, and Sherlock finding all of that out. That was really one of the only parts of Season 5 that I thought they did very, very well. And honestly, if this was Matt Letcher in the role, he might have possibly been higher on the list than the Thinker, or maybe even Savitar, but I just cannot get past thinking of how stupid it is. Every single time I see him, I think to myself, it doesn't make any sense, and I just can't get past that. It is one of the biggest plot holes on the show's history. They explained it in Crisis on Earth X. He said that he just likes the face, and then he just doesn't take it off for the entirety of the rest of the show. It makes no sense, and honestly, I just like Matt Letcher in the role so much better. He feels like more of a real version of Thawne, so I just cannot get past that. It pisses me off to no end, which is why he's at the bottom of the list of good villains, because from here on out, they all kind of suck. So honestly, the next 5 main villains are almost entirely interchangeable because they all kind of suck, including Cicada, who is, I guess, technically the most competent of the rest of the list, but that really isn't saying much. Cicada's second suit looks kind of cool, his dagger is quite unique and interesting as a main weapon, and it did give us a couple intense moments, at least in the beginning of Season 5. Honestly, for the first couple episodes, really up until the mid-season finale, Cicada was a pretty good villain, who really could have benefited from the graphic novel format that Bloodwork benefited from, because once the mid-season finale came around, well, that's where the trouble started. Team Flash basically found Cicada's weakness, and in those episodes and from there on out, Cicada became a complete non-threat who just kept on running away from Team Flash at every chance he got, and it's what I mentioned earlier of stretching out the main plot of the season and coming up with excuses for why the villain hasn't been defeated yet, and this lasted longer than the period of episodes where he was effective, which completely tainted any goodwill that Cicada ever had. When he was finally killed off and replaced by an even worse villain, Cicada II, and then also Reverse Flash, it felt like a relief because he was such a non-threat, and it didn't help that the actor was pretty bad also. I've made several videos about potential main villains for future seasons of the show, and the Evan McCulloch version of the Mirror Master was always on that list. The fact that he has his own separate dimension to explore, along with his cool powers, tragic backstory, and pretty iconic design for his costume, would probably work better than maybe any other member of the Rogues, except for potentially Captain Cold, to be his own separate main villain without the Rogues, but just not like this. First of all, they gender swapped Evan into Ava, which is never a good idea and almost never works, especially for like a main villain of this show, but the problems definitely didn't end there. They failed to make the most out of the mirror dimension, where they could have had something similar to Earth 2, or a world which is reversed, where maybe good guys are bad guys and vice versa, or a world where maybe everybody's genders are reversed, maybe everybody's roles in society are reversed. There are just so many options for them to go with, and in the comics there are other iterations of the universe or the dimension, and there are different ways you could go about it, but just not this, where Central City is technically physically reversed, but it's completely devoid of life or a population, so what is the point? It's just really a trap for Iris where she goes crazy, which is I guess not that bad for a story for Iris, but it completely throws away any potential for an interesting aspect of the mirror dimension. It doesn't help that Mirror Mistress had a pretty incredibly awful costume, and also a storyline that was naturally very frustrating to watch, where she's trying to kill a very awful person, and Barry keeps on risking his own life and the lives of others to save that awful person. I mean, he jumps in front of shards of mirror glass to stop him dying. It's incredibly frustrating and not particularly well done, and the fact that Ava was defeated with the power of love is so cringy. So I really have to go on. The only reason she isn't lower is because the actress wasn't awful, and she isn't really as terrible as the villains we'll get to later, but like I said earlier, they're mostly interchangeable. This is just so disappointing. Godspeed is a very interesting character in the comics and a very good villain who had a great initial storyline, and his subsequent pseudo-redemption arc was something that I would have loved to see on the show for a better version of Godspeed. Godspeed was also set up on the show for like 2 full seasons before finally becoming the main villain of just 4 episodes of a awful season, and that's not even the worst part. The whole Godspeed Clone War storyline ended up making no sense whatsoever. Godspeed's voice was the cringiest thing they've ever had on the show. It was ridiculous. His movements and the way they shot him felt like an episode of Power Rangers, and his acting was like porn levels of god awful. It didn't help that almost everything else in these episodes sucked as well, but that's not really an excuse for this god awful for a portrayal of Godspeed. And the only reason he's not last place is honestly because he's a speedster, which is at the very least interesting. These episodes had a lot of speedsters in them, which saved them from being like the worst things I've ever seen, because speedsters are naturally very interesting and cool looking characters. So at least his powers looked cool, and he looks cool. His costume isn't awful, but for the most part, Godspeed is probably the most disappointing villain in the entire series. When Cicada II replaced Cicada, it definitely felt like a relief, and for the structure of the season, yeah, it ended up being a good thing. However, it was a really bad thing for the character. Like Godspeed, Grace Gibbons didn't get nearly enough episodes to be a main villain, and unlike Godspeed, it didn't really feel like she ever deserved it. I don't remember her speaking. Whenever she did appear in the episodes, did she really have any lines? Because I honestly don't remember. Sure, she had her kind of menacing moments, but she was just a nothing character. I don't remember any lines, I don't remember her motivation, I don't remember really anything about the character, other than the fact that she's the daughter, or actually niece, of Cicada, who came back somehow from the future. She basically just existed to fill in more episodes, because Cicada was becoming incredibly stale, because the writers thought it'd be a good idea for the Flash to discover his biggest weakness in like episode 8, and from there on out, like I said earlier, he became an incredibly unmenacing character, so they had to replace him. But they wouldn't have had to replace him if the season was just a couple episodes shorter, and that's why Cicada version 2 is lower than Cicada and so low on the list, because despite being a bit menacing from time to time, she's just an incredibly unnecessary character. She's filler. She's a filler character there to just fill in more episodes, and that is it. So yeah, Cicada 2 is really forgettable. She's a filler villain and one of the worst of the show. So I was having a bit of a tough time really deciding on the bottom couple of this list, like who is the actual worst main villain of The Flash, and I'm still not that adamant about this being the worst, but there's one main villain who I think that represents everything wrong with Season 7 and everything wrong with what The Flash does, and that's the Speed Force, which is weird to say. Why is the Speed Force the main villain of a season of The Flash? I don't know. But the Speed Force is so weird. Everything about this was so weird. You would swear that the writers were on crack the entire time writing it. Everything about the story was just baffling. Barry and Iris creating the forces with the power of love is obviously cringe, but that's one thing. Going ahead and calling them your kids, calling them like my children, and then the human avatar of those forces, call them mom and dad. I mean, it's so weird, and it's arguably even weirder for the Speed Force herself, as she uses the form of Barry's mother, which is a bit unusual and slightly disrespectful, but she's done it in the past. But then Iris starts calling her Nora, and then everybody else starts calling her Nora, and then even Barry starts calling her Nora, the name of his mother. But then it turns out that the Speed Force was recreated by Barry and Iris, so she's considered their daughter for some reason, but that means that that's their daughter taking the form of his mother, and they're calling her by the name of his mother, while they have another daughter with the exact same name who was erased from existence. I'll say it again, everything about this whole situation that they decided to write is weird and kind of fucked up. It doesn't help that Nora was incredibly poorly written, and certainly didn't come off as menacing at all, and it was never a good idea to make the Speed Force, the source of Barry's powers, the main villain of a season or a graphic novel. So in the end, it wasn't the Power Rangers villain Godspeed that was the worst, it wasn't the frustrating storylines of Cicada or Mirror Mistress that was the worst, and it wasn't the nothingness that was Cicada II. No, in my opinion, the weirdness of the Speed Force as the main villain, and frankly the unwatchable storylines that it gave us, that's the worst main villain on The Flash ever.